What lies behind a single audacious mistake? It is not a failure on the battlefield, nor a commander's miscalculation. It is the decision of an entire people to raise their hand against the greatest empire of the age. And now, retribution is coming for them, by sea. By the end of the summer of 490 BC, more than just a military campaign was unfolding in the eastern Mediterranean. This was a punitive expedition. The distinction is fundamental. Armies fight for territory, for resources, or for power. Punitive expeditions come for one thing: punishment. The Persian Empire stretched from the banks of the Indus to the Aegean Sea. Dozens of nations lived under the rule of King Darius I. They paid tribute, they supplied soldiers, they asked no questions. Such was the order of things. But a few years prior, this order was shattered. The Ionian Greeks, living under Persian rule on the coast of Asia Minor, revolted. Athens sent them 20 ships. 20 ships against an empire that could field hundreds of thousands of warriors. The revolt was suppressed. The Persian army burned Miltiades to the ground, and its inhabitants were sold into slavery. Herodotus writes that when news of this reached Athens, the citizens were plunged into inconsolable grief. But grief is neither a shield nor a spear. Darius, according to the same Herodotus, commanded a servant to remind him 3 times every day at dinner, "Master, remember the Athenians." Athens had not been forgotten. The hour of reckoning was at hand. Command of the expedition was entrusted to 2 men: Datis, a Median general, seasoned and ruthless, a veteran of dozens of campaigns, and Artaphernes, the nephew of Darius himself and son of the satrap of Lydia. Behind him stood the resources of an entire province and a personal stake in the mission's success. These were not mercenaries. They were instruments of the state's will. While the Persian fleet gathered off the coast of Cilicia, the Greek world demonstrated what it did best: division. Dozens of city-states watched the approaching threat and reached different conclusions. Each had its own logic, and each of those logics led to the same outcome. The islands in the fleet's path were the first to surrender. Rhodes, Samos, Naxos. Persian envoys arrived with a single demand: earth and water. It was a symbolic gesture of submission. A handful of earth, a cup of water, and you acknowledged Darius's authority over you. The price of refusal was already well known. The inhabitants of Naxos, who had dared to resist a few years earlier, had seen their homes burn. This time, their island surrendered without a fight. Among those sailing with the Persian fleet was a man personally known in Athens: Hippias. He had been the tyrant of Athens for more than 20 years before being exiled. The fledgling democracy had cast him out, and he found refuge at the Persian court, spending years persuading Darius to restore him to the throne. Now nearly 70 years old, he was aged and infirm, yet he knew the shores of Attica better than any Persian commander. He knew the mountain passes. He knew the landing sites. He knew exactly who in Athens had reason to welcome the Persians with open arms. Herodotus reports that Hippias guided the fleet to the shores of the Marathon Plain. The old tyrant was returning home in the baggage train of the occupiers. In Athens, they were well aware of this. His presence aboard the Persian ships meant one thing: there were people within the city ready to open the gates. The Athenian political elite was not monolithic. Democracy was young, barely 2 decades old. Aristocratic families who had lost influence under the new regime viewed the Persian fleet differently than the farmers and artisans did. For some, it was the end. For others, an opportunity. It was this internal division that made the situation truly lethal. An external enemy with a fleet of 600 ships is a tangible threat. A threat you cannot see is much harder to stop. Meanwhile, the fleet was methodically advancing through the Aegean, island by island, point by point. The next target was Eretria, a city-state on the island of Euboea that had also sent ships to the Ionians. After that, Athens. The schedule of retribution was set in advance. The schedule of retribution was set. But Athens was not yet alone. While the Persian fleet crossed the Aegean, the city made the only decision that could still change the course of history. They needed help. They needed allies. They needed Sparta. Sparta possessed the strongest land army in Greece. That was undisputed. Spartan hoplites were professionals from birth. They did not practice trades, they did not plow fields, and they did not trade. They trained. From the age of 7 until death. If anyone could stop the Persian infantry in an open field, it was them. The Athenian strategists understood this, and they dispatched a messenger. His name was Phidippides, a professional long-distance runner. Herodotus called him a hemerodromos, a day runner, a man whose craft was covering distances an ordinary soldier could not traverse in 2 days. The journey from Athens to Sparta was roughly 240 kilometers through the rugged mountain passes of the Peloponnese. Phidippides covered this distance in less than 48 hours. He arrived in Sparta on the 2nd day after leaving Athens. He was received, he was heard, and he was refused. It was not out of fear. The Spartans did not fear the Persians, or at least they did not say so openly. The reason was religious. The festival of Carneia was approaching, a sacred time in honor of Apollo. According to Spartan law, all military action was forbidden during the Carneia. To march before the full moon would be an insult to the god. Sparta would march, but only later, after the festival, when the moon entered the proper phase. Herodotus records this answer without comment. It was simply a fact. But the fact spoke for itself. The strongest army in Greece would be watching the phases of the moon while the Persian fleet disembarked troops on the Attic coast. Phidippides turned and ran back. 240 kilometers in reverse, empty-handed. While he ran, the fate of anyone still doubting the gravity of Persian intentions was unfolding to the north. The Persian fleet entered the strait between the mainland and Euboea. On Euboea stood Eretria, the city that had sent 5 ships to the Ionians. 5 ships. Now, an entire army was at its walls. Eretria defended itself for 6 days. Then, the gates were opened from within. 2 citizens, Herodotus names them as Euphorbus and Philagrus, decided it was better to negotiate with the victors than to perish with the vanquished. The Persians entered the city. Temples were torched in retaliation for the Persian sanctuaries burned during the Ionian revolt. The inhabitants of Eretria, all who had not managed to flee, were bound and loaded onto ships. They were taken deep into the heart of the Persian Empire, where Darius settled them in Sicya, far from the sea. Herodotus writes that they still lived there in his own time. A city that had stood for centuries ceased to exist in 6 days. This is not a metaphor. It was a systematic process. News of Eretria reached Athens before the Persian fleet rounded the Cape and set course for Marathon. In Athens, this news did one thing. It killed the last of their illusions. Walls had not saved Eretria. Negotiations had not saved Eretria. The hope that the Persians would be satisfied with a symbolic tribute and depart had not saved Eretria. Traitors within the city had done the rest. Now the Athenians looked at their own neighbors with suspicion. Who among them was an Euphorbus? Who was a Philagrus?
Democracy could not read minds. Tyranny could. Under a tyrant, informers worked for reward. Under a democracy, no one knew whom to trust. The small city-state of Plataea sent 1,000 hoplites, every man they had. Herodotus notes this fact with undisguised respect. The Plataeans were not obligated to come. They owed no debt to Athens comparable to the threat they faced from Persia. But they came anyway. 1,000 men against an army carried by 600 ships. From the other Greek city-states, there was only silence. Corinth was occupied with its own affairs. Argos openly sympathized with the Persians, hoping the victors would weaken Sparta. Others simply waited. The logic of the bystanders was simple. Why die for Athens if Athens was already doomed? Athens stood nearly alone, bolstered only by 1,000 Plataeans and abandoned by Sparta. The fleet of Datis and Artaphernes rounded Euboea and set course for Attica. On board were the conquered Eretrians, a silent, living testament to what happens to those who do not resist fiercely enough. And somewhere on the road through the mountain passes of the Peloponnese, covered in dust and sweat from 2 consecutive marathon runs, Phidippides carried Sparta's answer back to Athens. The moon was not yet in the right phase. The moon was not yet in the right phase, and the Persian fleet was already in sight of the Attic coast. 600 ships entered the Bay of Marathon. This was no random choice. Hippias knew this plain. He had spent years here. The Marathon Valley is a wide, flat strip of land between the mountains and the sea. Marshes hemmed it in from the north and south. In the center lay an open space about 8 kilometers long and 3 wide. For infantry, it was a death trap. For cavalry, it was the perfect staging ground. This was exactly what Datis required. The Persian heavy cavalry was the empire's primary instrument of victory in open fields. It had decided battles from Mesopotamia to Thrace. On the Marathon Plain, it had the room to maneuver, to build speed, and to strike the flank of any formation, shattering it. Hippias had brought the fleet to the one place where the cavalry would be unstoppable. The old tyrant was moving to collect on his bet. The Persian army began to disembark. Herodotus does not provide an exact number, and later sources vary. Modern historians estimate the Persian landing force at approximately 25,000 to 30,000 infantry and several thousand cavalry. But for the 10,000 Athenian hoplites and 1,000 Plataeans marching to meet them, the exact figure was irrelevant. They were outnumbered, and heavily so. The Athenian militia advanced from the city and took up positions in the mountain passes leading from the plain into Attica. It was the only sensible move. The Marathon Plain was exposed. To enter it was to invite a cavalry charge on their flanks. By blocking the passes, they forced the Persians to either attack head-on across a narrow front, where numerical superiority was nullified by the terrain, or to wait. The Greeks stood in the narrow gaps and waited. The Persian camp was established on the plain. Tents, campfires, supplies, and hitching posts appeared as the army settled in. They were in no hurry. Athens wasn't going anywhere. It was here that a crisis began, one often discussed less than the battle itself. A crisis of command. The Athenian army was led by 10 strategists, one from each of the 10 Athenian tribes. In addition to them was the Polemarch Callimachus, the supreme military magistrate, whose vote served as the tiebreaker. The system was democratic and collegial. Every vote was equal. At that critical moment, this system paralyzed the army. There was no consensus among the 10 strategists. Some insisted on immediate battle,
while others argued for delay. The arguments on both sides were compelling. Those in favor of waiting reasoned that Sparta had promised to come.
In a few days, the full moon would arrive, and the Spartan hoplites would march. With thousands of elite reinforcements, the odds would shift entirely. Why die today when you could fight tomorrow with allies at your side? Those in favor of immediate battle countered that every day of delay favored the Persians. Hippias knew the names of the tyranny's supporters in Athens. A prolonged standoff under the shadow of invasion created a pressure that could split the city from within. Eventually, someone would open the gates, just as they had in Eretria. Callimachus listened to both sides and remained silent. The Greek camp was situated in the Grove of Heracles, a sacred site at the foot of the mountains. The position was flank protected, with the front facing a narrow pass and the road to Athens behind them. It was an excellent defensive position, but a poor one for an attack. From the Persian shore, thousands of eyes watched the Greek camp. Archers from Media and Persia, infantry from Bactria and Scythia, and horsemen whose mounts stood already saddled by the water. It was a motley, multilingual imperial host. They were settling in, preparing food and repairing gear. They did not attack because they had no reason to rush. One day passed, then a second. The Greeks held the passes, the Persians held the plain. Between the two camps lay several kilometers of open field. No one moved, but the situation shifted with every passing hour. Provisions in the Greek camp were dwindling. Tension was mounting. In the Persian camp, Datis surveyed the scene and realized the enemy did not dare to attack. He held the initiative. Among the 10 strategists was one who saw the situation differently. His name was Miltiades. He possessed something the other 9 lacked. He knew how the Persians fought. Not from books or stories, but from personal experience. Miltiades knew the Persians intimately. This is neither a metaphor nor an exaggeration. Years earlier, he had ruled the Thracian Chersonese, a peninsula on the European shore of the Bosphorus, as a tyrant under Persian suzerainty. He had seen the Persian army on the march. He knew its structure, its tactics, and its strengths. Most importantly, he knew the Persian way of war. Their infantry kept its distance. They won through archery. Clouds of arrows would break an enemy's formation and sow panic. Only then would the infantry move in to finish off a demoralized foe. It was a proven system that worked everywhere, every time. But it had one fatal weakness. If the enemy could close the distance and breach the archer's range, the system collapsed. In close quarters combat, an archer was defenseless against a heavily armed hoplite. Miltiades went to Callimachus. Herodotus preserved the essence of their conversation. Miltiades spoke bluntly. He explained that delay was not a salvation, but a death sentence. Not on the battlefield, but in Athens itself. Every day spent waiting strengthened those ready to surrender. Traitors in the city were merely waiting for the right moment. If the Greek army remained idle in the mountains, that moment would arrive before Sparta did. The city would fall from within, just like Eretria. He then offered a second, more clinical argument. The Persian cavalry was the primary threat on the open plain. However, cavalry could not operate effectively at night, nor in narrow passes. They required space and time to accelerate. Furthermore, they required fodder. Every day of idleness meant the depletion of forage and the logistical strain of watering thousands of horses. The Persian resources were not infinite. Finally, Miltiades spoke of reconnaissance. He brought a detail that changed everything. The Persian cavalry had disappeared. Not entirely,
but a significant portion was gone. Greek scouts reported that the Persians were loading horses back onto the ships. This was not a retreat, it was a maneuver.
Datis had decided to split his forces. Part of the army would remain at Marathon to pin the Greek militia in place, preventing them from withdrawing to the city. The other part, with the cavalry on board, would sail around Cape Sunion to strike directly at the walls of Athens, while its defenders were stranded in the mountains, hours away. It was an elegant plan. While the Greeks waited for Sparta, Athens would fall. Callimachus listened. He remained silent for a moment, then made his decision. He cast his vote for battle. Among the 10 strategists, those who had advocated for an immediate strike offered Miltiades command on the day of the engagement. Herodotus writes that each of these men, when his scheduled turn to lead arrived, ceded his authority to Miltiades. Thus, a single man gained operational control of the army. The day of battle, however, had not yet dawned. The Greek army stood and waited for the right moment. This waiting was not passive. It was psychological warfare. The Persians pressed them mentally. Scythian horse archers, not Numidians but their Persian counterparts, approached the Greek lines, loosed their arrows, and retreated. Provoking, testing, searching for a break in the ranks, a moment where someone would give chase and expose a flank. The Greeks stood their ground. They held their formation and did not react. The atmosphere in camp was heavy, not with the weight of wounds, but with the weight of waiting. It was a different kind of exhaustion, one that gnawed from within. A farmer from Attica, clad in bronze armor and clutching a spear, stood in the ranks with a single thought. His home lay just beyond those mountains. His family was there, and every hour of delay brought the Persian fleet 1 hour closer to the walls of his city. Miltiades waited for confirmation. He waited until the scouts reported precisely. The cavalry was on the ships. The horsemen had departed. The report arrived.
Perhaps at this very moment, Herodotus does not record the exact hour, Miltiades gave the order to prepare for battle at dawn. The army began to redeploy, silently, under the cover of darkness. 10,000 Athenians and 1,000 Plataeans broke camp near the Grove of Heracles and moved to the edge of the plain. Ahead lay open ground. There, at the far end of the valley, the Persian campfires flickered. The distance between the two armies was roughly a mile. This was the ground the Greek formation would have to cover under a hail of Persian arrows. Every hoplite in the line knew it. Each man calculated the distance in his mind and understood. As they advanced, they would die. Arrows traveled farther than a man could run in the time he had. If they marched at a walk, no one would reach the enemy. If they marched at a walk, no one would reach the enemy. Miltiades knew this, and that was precisely why his order was what it was. Before dawn, the Greek formation completed its redeployment at the edge of the plain. Miltiades surveyed his forces. 10,000 Athenians, 1,000 Plataeans, 11,000 men against an army that outnumbered them 2 to 1, perhaps even 3 to 1. A direct frontal assault with equal lines meant certain defeat. The math was not in the Greeks' favor. So Miltiades changed the math. He stretched the formation. A standard Athenian phalanx was 8 ranks deep, a wall of shields providing density, mass, and striking power. Miltiades ordered the flanks to maintain their normal depth, but critically weakened the center, reducing it to 4 ranks, perhaps even fewer. His goal was singular: to match the width of the Persian front. He had to prevent the Persian infantry and horse from outflanking and encircling his men. It was a dangerous gamble. The center was thin. If the Persians struck there with full force, It would buckle. It might even break. Miltiades accepted this risk consciously, knowing the alternative was worse.
An outflanked phalanx died to the last man.
A broken center was a manageable disaster, provided the flanks held. Across the plain, Datis's army also formed up. The Persian battle order was honed to clockwork precision. In the center stood the elite, Median and Persian infantry, the core of the expeditionary force. On the flanks were lighter troops from the conquered territories. In front were the skirmishers and archers, thousands of them. The Persian bow had an effective range of roughly 150 to 170 meters. At 100 meters, an arrow could pin an unarmored man to the earth. A Greek hoplite was no unarmored target. He wore a bronze helmet, a bronze breastplate, or a layered linen cuirass, and greaves. He carried a massive wooden shield faced with bronze, covering him from chin to knee. But arrows found the gaps: the throat above the shield's rim, the thigh below, the ankle above the greave. At 150 meters, under a rain of thousands of shafts, those gaps would be found. The only way to survive the storm was to spend as little time under it as possible. Miltiades gave the order. The Greek formation moved. First at a walk to maintain alignment and keep the ranks tight, then faster, then a run. Herodotus records this with naked astonishment. He writes that the Athenians were the first Greeks he knew of to charge an enemy at a run. To him, it was a feat worthy of special mention because it was unprecedented. A hoplite in full kit carried 50 to 60 pounds of bronze, wood, and iron. To run a mile in that gear was a physical trial at the very limit of human endurance, even without a sky full of arrows. The Persian commanders watched, uncomprehending. Herodotus states it plainly. The Persians concluded the Greeks had gone mad. Madmen. They were charging without cavalry to cover their flanks, without archer support, simply sprinting across open ground toward a superior force. This incomprehension was no minor detail. It was a key reason the maneuver worked.
The Persian archers opened fire. Thousands of arrows arced into the sky, falling in a parabolic rain upon the advancing Greeks. The first volleys found their mark. Arrows slammed into shields and ricocheted off bronze. Some found flesh. Men fell. The formation closed over them. Neighbors stepped forward to fill the gaps, never stopping, never slowing. The run continued. Stopping a charging phalanx required time for aimed shots, time the Persians didn't have. An archer might loose 2, 3, at most 4 volleys at a target, closing the distance at a run. Against a marching target, he could lose 10 or 15. That difference determined how many men would actually reach the Persian line. The ground was firm underfoot. Dust billowed behind the formation as 11,000 men in bronze crossed the plain of Marathon. The thunder of their stride grew into a continuous low roar. Shield struck shield in the rhythm of the charge, spears leveled. The Persian archers loosed their final volleys, but the arrows no longer had time to fly. The distance had closed to a few dozen meters. Then, impact. The collision of the phalanx was nothing like the graceful depictions on ancient vases. It was brutal. 2 walls of flesh, metal, and wood collided at the speed of a running man. The front ranks absorbed the shock with their bodies. The spears of the first rank struck at arm's length. The second rank thrust over the shoulders of the first, the third over the second. For several meters, it was a solid wall of iron points. Those first seconds of contact decided whose formation would hold and whose would shatter.
the Greek phalanx held. On the flanks, the result was immediate. The reinforced wings of the Greek line crashed into the Persian flanks where the lighter levies stood. They hadn't expected this tempo. They had prepared for a methodical exchange of arrows and a gradual closing, conventional, ranged warfare. Instead, a bronze wall slammed into them at full tilt.
In the center, however, the picture was different. There stood the Persian elite, Median and Persian infantry, professionals. They did not panic. They absorbed the impact of the thin Greek center and pushed back. They pressed with sheer mass and numbers. The Greek center was 4 ranks deep against 8 or 10 of the finest soldiers the empire had to offer. The Greek center began to give ground. They were not fleeing, they were retreating. There is a world of difference between the two, and that difference was life itself. A fleeing formation is a panicked mass of exposed backs, the end of an army. A retreating formation is a controlled backward movement under pressure, shields up and spears leveled. The Greek center did exactly this. A step back, another. The Persian elite surged forward, sensing a breakthrough, and the Persian center began to pursue. This was precisely what Miltiades had banked on. Not a feat of heroism, but a cold calculation. Seeing the Greeks falter, the Persian commanders did what any experienced general would. They pressed the advantage. They committed more forces to the breach. They drove into the gap between the Greek flanks, which were still holding firm at the edges. It was a pocket, and they had just walked right into it. While the Persian center pursued, a different battle reached its climax on the wings. There, and this was crucial, the Greeks were winning. The reinforced Athenian and Plataean wings methodically crushed the Persian flanks. It wasn't quick or spectacular, it was systematic, rank by rank. The Persian archers, fearsome at a distance, were defenseless when pressed by hoplite shields. A short Persian sword against a long Greek spear was not a duel, it was an execution. The Persian flanks broke, first the right, then the left. They didn't retreat in an organized manner, they fled, scattering into a panicked mob with one goal: the ships. But the Greek wings did not chase the fugitives. Here, the Athenian and Plataean hoplites displayed the iron discipline Herodotus so admired. In the heat of battle, intoxicated by victory, they stopped, they turned, and they advanced toward the center, toward the Persian elite who, moments ago, thought they had won. The situation reversed in seconds. The Persian center, having driven deep in pursuit, suddenly found the Greek flanks closing behind them. Left and right, the pursuers became the pursued. The space around them constricted. Herodotus names names. He records that 2 brothers fell, Stesilaus and another whose name is lost to time. He mentions Cynaegirus, though his moment would come later by the water. Now, in the dust and blood of the plain, men died whose names history would never record. There were thousands of them, on both sides. The Persian center began to realize their predicament. It wasn't a thought, it was a physical sensation. Pressure from the rear, where their own lines should have been, was now a wall of spears. Pressure from the right, pressure from the left. Maneuvering room vanished. Men were packed so tightly they couldn't turn, couldn't draw a bow, couldn't even level a spear. They could only stand and die. The elite of the Persian corps, veterans of 100 victories, had fallen into a trap built from their own confidence. They had pushed too hard, too deep, and failed to notice the world closing in until it was gone. The pincers closed. The pincers snapped shut. Trapped inside were the finest soldiers of the Persian Empire. Encirclement is more than a tactical position. It is a psychological collapse. A man with a line of retreat fights differently than one with his back to the wall. Yet, sometimes a man cornered fights with the most desperation.
The Persian elite did not surrender. They fought. These were no raw recruits. They were killers, and they killed even as the ring tightened. But the ring continued to constrict. The Greek wings, having abandoned the chase, ground toward the center. Step, shield forward, spear level. Step. They did not rush. Haste was an invitation to death. One could easily be impaled by a trapped man still on his feet. The phalanx operated like a machine. The front rank held the line, while the rear ranks struck over their shoulders. The Persian center, hemmed in on three sides, was crushed into an ever-shrinking space. In that suffocating crush, the Persian archers were useless. A bow requires distance and room to draw. In a crowd where men stood shoulder to shoulder, a bow was nothing more than a stick. A Persian infantryman with a short sword and a wicker shield was no match for a bronze-clad hoplite with a 7-foot spear. The disparity in equipment was absolute. Herodotus records the final toll. The Persians lost 6,400 men on the field. The Greeks lost 192. The disparity was so staggering that later historians questioned it for centuries. Yet Herodotus's figures remain our primary source, and they reflect the reality of what happens when a long-range army loses its distance. 192 Athenians. Their names were carved into the burial mound, the Soros, that still stands at Marathon. Each name represented a life: a farmer, a craftsman, a son, a father. Herodotus lists the fallen generals, including Stesilaus. The other 192 remain without individual biographies, remembered only as a collective mound of earth. Before the ring could fully seal, a portion of the Persian center managed to break through. It wasn't an organized retreat, but a desperate scramble toward the gap, toward the sea, toward the ships, the only escape left. And the Greeks gave chase. Pursuit is the most perilous phase of battle for the victor. Formations dissolve. Men spread out, each running at his own pace. The discipline that binds the phalanx into a single organism begins to fray under the heat of victory. This is when a seasoned enemy can turn and strike back at a scattered foe. But the Persian center was no longer a tactical entity. It was a mob. They fled across the plain, through the coastal scrub and into the marshes. The shore at Marathon was no pristine beach. It was a tangle of brush and wetlands reaching into the surf, where the ground turned to treacherous mud. The Persian army foundered. Horses sank into the mire. Men in full kit struggled knee-deep in the water. The Greeks fell upon them there, in the shallows, in the brush, in the silt. It was no longer a battle. It was a hunt. Herodotus captures the desperation of the moment with a single haunting detail. As the Greeks tried to seize the Persian ships to prevent the fleet's escape, an Athenian named Cynical, brother of the playwright Aeschylus, grabbed the stern of a departing vessel. His hand was severed by an axe. He gripped with the other. It, too, was lopped off. Some accounts say he then clamped his teeth onto the hull. The ship sailed anyway. Cynical died in the surf. This was no heroic legend. It was a testament to the ferocity of the struggle on the shore. A fight so close that men tried to hold back warships with their bare hands. The Greeks captured 7 ships out of 600. The rest escaped. Datis looked back at the shore, at the bodies of his men bobbing in the water, and the Greeks standing knee-deep in the sea with leveled spears. His expeditionary force was shattered, but his fleet was intact, and he still had his cavalry,
safely stowed aboard the ships days before. He gives the order. The fleet wheels south, setting course for Cape Sunion. Beyond the cape lies Athens. Defenseless Athens, whose army stands here on the Marathonian shore, caked in blood and dust, spent and trembling with exhaustion. Setting course for Cape Sunion. Datis is departing. But the Greeks' victory is only a half victory for now. Look at what remains on the Marathonian shore. 11,000 men.
They have stood in formation since dawn. They ran a mile in bronze armor under a hail of arrows. They fought hand to hand, in a struggle where every blow demands the weight of the whole body. They pursued the fleeing through marshes and brush. Now they stand, drenched in sweat, covered in dust and the blood of the enemy. Their hands shake with fatigue, and they must run again. Not now, in a few minutes' time. First, they must grasp what is happening, that the fleet is not sailing home, that the fleet is turning south, that Datis is not broken, he is regrouping, that the plan remains unchanged. While the Greek army stands here, the cavalry will land at the walls of Athens. Miltiades realizes this before anyone else. Perhaps he was expecting exactly this. Perhaps he had been tracking the ship's movements even during the heat of battle. Herodotus does not provide the strategist's inner monologue. He gives us the facts. Fact 1. The Greek army immediately begins the march back to Athens. No rest, no food, no time to bandage wounds, save for the most severe. Those who cannot walk, stay. The rest, all the rest, heave up their shields, shoulder their spears, and march. The road from Marathon to Athens is roughly 25 miles, over mountain paths and through passes, under the blistering August sun, in full kit. This is no metaphor for valor. It is a physical task with grueling parameters. The average speed of infantry in full gear is 2 to 3 miles per hour on level ground, less on mountain terrain. 25 miles means an 8 to 10 hour march. The Persian fleet rounds Cape Sunion and steers for Phaleron Bay. The sea distance around the cape is about 37 miles. With a favorable wind, 6 to 8 hours. It is a race, and the margin is razor thin. The men march. Then, where the road allows, they run. Then they march again.
The bronze cuirasses that deflected arrows an hour ago now weigh on their shoulders, chafing skin and absorbing the heat of the August sun. Greaves bite into their shins differently on a long march than in battle, not sharply, but methodically, with every step. The water is gone. The streams of Marathon are far behind. No one strips their armor. They march in full kit, because if the fleet arrives first, and the Persian cavalry meets them at the walls of Athens, they will have to fight instantly, with no time to arm. In Athens itself, a different kind of tension hangs in the air. The city knows the army went to Marathon. The city does not know how the battle ended. The first fugitives from the field could have brought any news. Herodotus mentions that some Persian ships raised a shield as a signal, a sign to Athenian traitors that the moment had arrived. Who gave the signal remains unknown. Herodotus names a clan that was suspected, but adds there was no proof. That shield is one of the darker details of the Marathon story. It was seen. Its meaning remains a mystery. But the mere fact of its appearance suggests that Datis was counting on a welcome inside the city, on open gates, on a repeat of Eretria. The army quickens its pace. In the passes, men lean on one another. A wounded man who can still walk grips his neighbor's shoulder. He who collapses from exhaustion is kicked back to his feet. There is no romance here.
Only men who understand. If they are late, everything they just paid for in blood on the Marathonian plain will be for nothing. Herodotus does not describe the march in detail. He simply states the result. The army reaches Athens and takes up positions near Phaleron Bay before the Persian fleet enters it. This is, perhaps, the most critical before in Greek history. We do not know how many minutes separated the two forces. Herodotus did not keep time. But as the Persian fleet nears the shore, they see the Greek hoplites waiting. The very same men. In the same bronze, carrying the same shields. The men Datis had left on the Marathonian shore only hours before. They are here. They made it. The polemarch Callimachus did not live to see this moment. He fell at Marathon. Herodotus records his death among the Greek losses without further detail. The man whose voice decided the fate of the battle did not live to see its conclusion. Cynaegirus died on the beach, his hands hacked off. Stesilaus lies in the burial mound with the other 192. The men who made the decision and paid the price paid it in full. Those now standing at Phaleron Bay watch the Persian fleet. The fleet sits at anchor. It does not disembark. It waits. Datis looks to the shore. He sees the bronze. He sees the shields. He sees the line. The gates will not open. The gates will not open. Datis realizes this before the first ship even drops anchor in Phaleron Bay. He surveys the shore with the professional eye of a man who has spent his life sizing up the enemy. He does not see a mob. He sees a formation, a disciplined line, shields locked, spears leveled. These men stood in phalanx this morning at Marathon. They fought hand to hand. They hunted his soldiers through the marshes. And now they are here, on the shore, at the walls of the city he came to seize. Datis does not give the order to land. Herodotus does not explain his motives. He simply records the fact. The Persian fleet lingered by the shore and then departed. But the motives are clear from the circumstances. Landing in the face of a prepared army is not an operation. It is suicide. The ships approach the shore slowly. Soldiers must descend gangplanks or leap into the surf. In that moment, they are defenseless. And on the shore stand the men who just routed his finest infantry in the open field. The cavalry on the ships, that might have changed the calculus. But cavalry requires space to land. It needs a level shore, a gentle slope, room to deploy.
Phaleron Bay is not the Marathonian plain, and there are no traitors on the shore waiting to throw open the gates. The fleet waits. An hour, perhaps two. Then it weighs anchor. The Persian armada turns and strikes east, back across the Aegean, to the shores of Asia, to Darius, who will demand an explanation for the failure of a punitive expedition meant to wipe Athens from the earth, just as Eretria was wiped away. On the shore at Phaleron Bay, 11,000 men watch the sails recede. They stand in their armor, without water, without food. They have been on their feet since dawn. Behind them lies a mile-long run under arrows, hand-to-hand combat, a pursuit through marshes, and a 25-mile mountain march in the midday August heat. Their bodies are pushed to the absolute limit, past the point of fatigue, into that numbness where a man ceases to feel pain simply because he has no resources left to process it.
They watch the receding sails in silence. Herodotus does not describe this moment. No triumphant shouts, no general's speech. The fleet simply leaves, and that is all. Among those standing on the shore is a man who ran this distance twice in a single day. Out through the mountains, back empty-handed. Then through the mountains again, this time with the army. Miltiades, a professional messenger. In the last few days, his legs have covered a distance most people do not travel in a month. There is a version of the story, later, not from Herodotus, that it was Miltiades who ran from Marathon to Athens with the news of victory. That he arrived, uttered a single word, victory, and died. Herodotus does not tell this story. In his account, Miltiades is the messenger to Sparta and back, nothing more. The legend of the run from Marathon appears in sources centuries later. Historians debate its authenticity. But this much is authentic. On this day, men truly did run from Marathon to Athens. Not one man, an entire army. 25 miles. In bronze.
After a battle.
This is a documented fact, and this fact in itself requires no embellishment. The day after the Persian fleet departs, the Spartans enter Athens. 2,000 hoplites. They had marched from Sparta at an accelerated pace as soon as the Carnea festival ended and the moon entered the correct phase. They marched fast, by Spartan standards. By the standards of the Athenians who stood at Marathon without allies, they were exactly too late for everything. The Spartans ask to see the battlefield. They are led to Marathon. They walk across the plain. They look at the bodies. Herodotus describes this in a single sentence. The Spartans examined the Persians lying on the field, praised the Athenians, and went home. Praised them, and left. This is, perhaps, the most Spartan moment in history. No apologies, no explanations, no promises. They looked at what the Athenians had accomplished without them, acknowledged the quality of the work, and returned to their own affairs. The Athenians bury their dead right there on the field. They do not transport them back to the city. They bury them where they fell. This was a break from custom. Greeks usually brought their fallen home, but 192 men receive a burial mound on the Marathonian plain. A Soros. It stands there to this day. It is some 30 feet high. Beneath it lie the men who decided not to wait. The Persian dead, 6,400 of them. They are buried separately, in mass graves, without names. The empire does not bring its dead home. The plain empties. August turns to September. The dust settles. Birds circle over the marshes by the shore. Darius's punitive expedition is over. Athens stands. Democracy, young, fragile, barely 20 years old, has survived its collision with a machine that had ground down dozens of nations and states. But Darius is alive, and he remembers the Athenians. Darius is alive, and he remembers the Athenians.
But the 10 years remaining to him will be spent suppressing a revolt in Egypt, not on Athens. Darius will die before he can return. His son, Xerxes, will come 10 years later, with an army that will make Datis's Marathonian corps look like a mere scouting party. But that is another story. First, we must address what Marathon did to the world in that moment. Look at what changed in a single day. Before Marathon, the Persian infantry was considered invincible in open field combat, not as a matter of legend, but as a matter of practice.
They simply did not lose. The Ionian revolt had been crushed. Thrace was conquered. Macedon had submitted without a fight. Nation after nation, polis after polis, all who stood in the path of the Persian punitive machine either surrendered or ceased to exist. The system worked. It worked so consistently that for most Greek polis, the question was not win or lose, but how dearly to sell their submission. Marathon broke that mechanism. Not because the Athenians were stronger than the Persians, they were not. They found a specific vulnerability in a specific tactic and exploited it under specific conditions. The lack of cavalry, a narrow front that neutralized numerical superiority, a charge that minimized time under the arrows, the discipline of the flanks, which refused to break formation to pursue the fleeing. None of this was luck. These were decisions made by men under pressure, in circumstances where most make the wrong choice. But the impact of these decisions reached far beyond tactics. The Greek polis, watching from behind their walls and from the islands as the Persian fleet sailed toward Attica, received information they had never had before. The Persians could be beaten. Not in an ambush, not in a mountain pass, not under the cover of night, but in an open field battle, in broad daylight, by a citizen militia. This knowledge changed every calculation. Not immediately, not for everyone.
August continued to sympathize with the Persians. Some islands continued to pay tribute. Fear did not vanish in a day. But a crack had appeared in the image of invincibility, and 10 years later, when Xerxes arrives with a fleet of 1,200 ships and an army of such size that modern historians still struggle to believe Herodotus's figures, the Greeks will still come out to fight. Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, all of these are the direct consequences of what happened on the Marathonian plain in 490 BC. Athens extracted something concrete and cynical from this victory: hegemony. Before Marathon, Athens was merely one of many poleis. Influential, yes, and commercial, with a young democracy that many neighbors viewed as a political experiment with dubious prospects. After Marathon, Athens is the only polis that, alone and without Sparta, defeated the Persian army in the field. This was more than prestige. It was an argument in every subsequent political dispute. When the Athenians demanded funds for a fleet, they pointed to Marathon. When they claimed command of allied forces, they pointed to Marathon. When they built an empire of willing and unwilling allies, the memory of those 192 men in the burial mound served as the foundation. The dead of the Marathonian marshes became the political capital of the living. Miltiades, the hero of the hour, requested an olive wreath and a triumphal entry from the popular assembly. He was refused. Herodotus records the Athenians' response: "The wreath belongs to him who conquers alone. Marathon was won by the whole people." A year later, Miltiades would fail in an expedition against the island of Paros, suffer a severe wound, be prosecuted for the failure, and die in prison of gangrene. Democracy is not sentimental. The 192 men in the burial mound did not know their deaths would become the bedrock of the Athenian Empire. They knew only this: if not them, then no one. If not now, then never. Sparta watched the moon. Allies calculated risks. Traitors waited for their moment. They did not wait. This is what Marathon, as a historical fact, offers us in the final analysis. Not a miracle, not divine intervention, not the inherent superiority of one civilization over another. It was a specific tactical decision made by a specific man in specific circumstances, executed by men who had everything to lose, and who decided it was better to lose their lives running
than their freedom standing still. The Persian Empire weathered Marathon without upheaval. 6,400 dead, these were the losses of a single expedition among dozens. Darius did not even deem it necessary to lead the punitive campaign himself. For an empire stretching from the Indus to the Aegean, this was a mere setback on the periphery. For Athens, it was everything. And here is the final question the Marathonian Plain poses to anyone looking upon it today. Not a rhetorical one, but a practical one. 10 generals voted. The votes were split. One man convinced another. Callimachus voted for battle, and the battle took place. Had Callimachus voted otherwise, the Greek army would have remained in the mountain passes, waiting for Sparta, waiting for the moon, waiting until the traitors inside Athens did what Euphorbus and Philagros had done in Eretria. Freedom that relies on outside help instead of its own bronze meets the same end as Eretria. A nameless burial mound. Slavery in Chios. Silence where a city once stood. The Athenians chose to run, under a hail of arrows, in bronze, without guarantees. And that is precisely why we know their names.